Well, thank you very much, Nancy, for that very kind introduction. And friends at SIBF, good to see you again. We'll do this virtually. It'd sure be nice to do this in person. What has changed since the last time we were together? Fortunately, not a whole lot in terms of the red-blue division, but we're going to focus on solutions today. And we're very fortunate to be joined by some very prestigious guests. I want to introduce those guests and we'll just get right into questions. Note that there will be time for Q&A, so save up your questions, put them in the Q&A portion, and we'll make sure we get a chance to get to all of them, as many as we can later on. So in alphabetical order, I would want to start with Mr. Leo Daughtry. Mr. Daughtry served as a Judge Advocate General with the United States Air Force, and after term in the Air Force, he founded his own law firm. He was a sole practitioner at Daughtry, Woodard, Lawrence, and Starling in Smithfield, North Carolina. He became active in politics in 1976 and was elected to the North Carolina Senate in 1989. His political career has expanded to both the North Carolina Senate and the North Carolina House of Representatives, including House Majority Leader and House Minority Leader. He famously ran for governor. He was a state senator for the state of North Carolina. He's gone to the Republican National Convention multiple times, and he served on numerous civic boards, the Community Foundation, Johnston County Schools. He was Man of the Year by Boy Scouts of America. And he's also a very proud alum of Wake Forest University, where he got his bachelor's and his law degree. Mr. Daughtry, it's a great pleasure for me to be able to speak with you today. Thank you for joining today's program.
Thank you for that very nice introduction.
Well, second, but only in alphabetical order, D-E-A-N, following D-A-U-G-H-T-R-Y, Mr. Karl Dean. Karl Dean was a graduate of Columbia University and then later went on to Vanderbilt, where he got his law degree. So we're talking to two lawyers today, folks. Mr. Dean served 2 terms in the office of mayor of Nashville, and very famously so. During his term in Nashville, it became recognized as Boomtown, one of the best cities for jobs and the IT city. He spent a lot of time investing in education and infrastructure and other initiatives that made Nashville kind of a famous place in the United States for folks to live and work. And we're still seeing the city boom since then. He was elected to 2 terms there. Prior to that, he was Nashville's public defender in 1990. He was reelected to in 94 and again in 1998. A long time as a public defender. He was a Metro Law Director as well which he served in before he resigned to run for the mayorship. Since then, he's gone into academia. He's been teaching a lot. He taught at Belmont University and also teaching at his alma mater. And he also taught at Boston University. So Mr. Dean, it gives me great pleasure to welcome the mayor of Boomtown to the program as well. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be with you all.
Well, folks, with our star-studded panel, I want to get right into it. We're talking about division in the country. Our program is called Politics. How can we get along? So the first question I want to ask of our panelists is, I want to set this up. Let me say it this way. Back in 1950, there was a famous report by the American Political Science Association. So we're talking 60 years ago. It said that American democracy suffered from its political parties being too similar. It said that we were dangerously similar. By contrast, right, in 2019, the National Capital Area Political Science Association published survey results showing that 15% of Republicans and 20% of Democrats think the country would be better off if large numbers of the opposing political party just died. Gentlemen, how did we go from being too similar to wishing death upon those who are not similar enough? Mr. Daughtry, I would like to start with you.
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. I don't think that these times of disagreement are just right now. I think they've been in our society and our country for years and years, even back at the time of the Revolution when Jefferson and Adams fought each other tooth and nail, the Civil War, when we had labor unions fighting management. Then in the 60s and 70s, we had riots, we had assassinations. So we've had a history of being divided in some respects, but I think now it is so bad that it has become a clear and present danger to our way of life. And I think how we got here starts with, more than anything, the fact that our Congress got so partisan that they began to lose their identity. They gave away all of their power almost. The War Powers Act, the only time they ever declared war was in World War II. They have not passed a budget since 1996. They have they've let the president, by executive order, do a great deal that they should have been doing, and then they've called on the Supreme Court in many areas that they also should have been doing. So Congress has let us down in so many respects, and they represent the community. And if congressmen fight and dislike each other, then the community will fight and dislike each other. It has become a very difficult time, and it seems to me the majority that we have of our political spectrum is now called the exhausted majority. They are fatigued by what's going on, and they really don't know what to do. It's almost like we have gotten to two tribes, and each tribe sort of hates each other now, and they're afraid of each other. I believe that the leaders of the both parties are not now disliked, but hated. Nancy Pelosi is probably hated, I think, by a lot of people, and certainly Trump is hated by a lot of people. So we are in a condition that is dangerous, and we do need, as a society, to find a way to bring us together if we can.
Appreciate those points very much. You focused on Congress and its dysfunction and gave many, many great examples. And I was curious to hear from you, Mr. Dean, if you see those similar trend lines, that we've had a history of being divided, and that's really, it's sort of this congressional dysfunction that is the greatest part of the fire that divides America. Is that how you see it, or do you see other historical causes sort of leading up to our present division?
Well, I think Leo's points about Congress are very good, and I think there's a lot of things related to that, such as gerrymandering, and sort of the primaries being so key to who is a member of Congress now that it becomes more and more extreme. But I agree that this, partisanship and acrimony in politics is nothing new. I can quote from a distinguished and somewhat controversial Nashville resident and former president, Andrew Jackson, who on his deathbed said, I have two regrets in my life and my career. Number one, I didn't hang John C. Calhoun, and number two, I didn't shoot John Henry Clay. So, I mean, fighting in politics has been around forever. And obviously after Jackson, we had a civil war where the country was unable to resolve the major differences, and we ended up going to the bloodiest war in US history. And the study you cited from 1950 to me is kind of interesting, because 1950 was, first 5 years after World War II. It was 2 years after the election of 1948, when Truman famously upset Dewey. And if you recall, Dewey ran sort of on a platform for the Republicans where he said, we're not going to go back on the New Deal. I mean, New Deals happened, and, it shouldn't go any further, but we're not going to rescind it. And so that was like a moment in time where the parties which had been fighting before sort of came to a point where there was a little bit of agreement. The Republicans were not going to change the New Deal, and the Democrats weren't either. And the conservatives in the Republican Party felt left out, that they had nowhere to go, that neither party was speaking to them. So that was kind of a unique time. And if you just think back with Roosevelt, to the elections before, when he was, winning big majorities, but he was hated too. I mean, he was, vilified by the Republican Party, but the Republican Party by 48, 50 figured out they're not going to beat him. And then, of course, you had that period of centrism with Eisenhower that continued too. And there were a lot of dissatisfied people in the Republican Party. And I think one of the things I would look at is and there's a lot been written on this, and Rick Perlstein's series on the Republican Party is fantastic on this stuff, is that what happened was you had the Republican Party became the right in the Republican Party, which everybody thought was going nowhere, was sort of resurrected by Barry Goldwater and others. And then at the same time, you had the civil rights movement in the South, where the Democratic Party over the course of 25 years became the party of civil rights and eventually lost the South to the Republican Party. And the parties sort of started over the course of the next 50 years really have moved into where they're identified as liberal and conservative. And they've become more partisan in the sense that the geographic divisions are clear. The Republican Party has parts of the country it represents, and the Democratic Party clearly has parts of the country it represents. And there are the battleground states, and that's where things are decided. But party identification now is probably greater in terms of the commitment to it than it's ever been in the past. And people see the parties as being very, very different than each other. And that can be a good thing, and that can be a bad thing. I'd also point to other periods of time, more recent, there's been a lot of stress. I mean, if you think of the Vietnam era and the protests that occurred then, and remember, people always talked about politics during the Vietnam era was that the center would not hold, the center wasn't holding. That's kind of what's happening now. There's no center, the center didn't hold. So we've been through this before, and I think we can get through it. I would say that we've gone from George W. Bush, who was a very polarizing figure and very controversial, and then Obama was more polarizing than Bush in terms of the polling, and then Trump just knocked it out of the park in terms of being polarizing. And I'm optimistic that our future leaders and maybe our current president can sort of lower the temperature.
I do appreciate that walk through history to contextualize kind of where we are, and I respect and hope that you're right about the future where we can kind of come together. Both of you have served.
May I add one more thing to that?
Please, yes, please, Mr.
So we've always had these times that come along where Americans band together, like, for example, 9/11. Never was there a time we felt so more together and patriotic. And then we had this year a pandemic, and you would think that all the people would be rallying around each other. We've got this disease, we didn't start it, but we have it, we've got to get rid of it. But the exact opposite happened.
Yeah.
And that's really a tragedy. And I also think that the pandemic has made the two sides even more difficult to get along with than before. It's really an anomaly to see what could have happened but didn't happen.
Absolutely, it's a tragedy squandered, right? We don't like to see
so.
those. There was studies pointing to the fact that how people responded to the pandemic, the greatest indicator of whether they were masked or not masked really was party preference. And it was a greater indicator than any other factor when looking at how they respond to the pandemic. Are you seeing this? You both have talked about federal levels and how we're seeing it clearly in Congress. Are you seeing this in the state level? Are you seeing this in municipal levels? Are you seeing it in your families? Or is this polarization going all the way down to our dinner tables? Mr. Dean, I'll start with you this time.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't know if there was a time in my lifetime where it was safe to have a political discussion at dinner with all your friends there. Because, I mean, certainly I have I'm a Democrat, and ran for mayor, nonpartisan election, and unsuccessfully ran for governor as a Democrat. So I have lots of friends, though, who are Republicans. I have family members who are Republicans and have argued with them at times and try not to. But I think that was true during the Obama administration, where I was probably defending the president and talking about, whether they were critical of the president. It certainly was true during George W. Bush's time and during the Iraq War and all the controversies there. So I don't think that is unusual. It certainly got more vehement, I think, during the Trump years. And I don't want to be, show my partisan colors too much, but I think Trump was unique. I mean, Trump was much more of a threat to, I think, the values of the country and democracy than anybody else. I mean, Obama has his critics, Bush has his critics, but I can tell you probably both of those guys are a lot more popular than they expected to be because of President Trump. And I think he was a different sort of entity in his behavior. So I think that's an issue. Certainly there is a little bit on the state level in Tennessee. Tennessee is very Republican. So, I mean, the big issues are certainly decided and the elections are decided in their primary. And I don't, having run for office, there are just more Republicans. That's what people believe here, and that's fine. And I understand that. Local government, Nashville's kind of Democratic. We are nonpartisan in our elections, and I think we are pretty genuinely nonpartisan in our elections. I don't think there's a little bit of sort of the partisanship creeping into it, but not much. I still think we look at it, and I think local politics is probably the best example for the country moving forward, how if you focus on issues that really matter to people, you can come to an agreement on things.
Right. How about you, Mr. Daughtry? Is it similar in North Carolina? Are you seeing that the division from the federal level at that state level as well, or even at the local or family level in your case?
Well, North Carolina is somewhat different than Tennessee. We are not a blue nor a red state. We're somewhere in the middle. We're sort of pink. We got a Democratic governor. We have a Republican House and Senate, state House and Senate. But one thing about 2 or 3 years ago, we had a transgender bill about that. It's called the bathroom bill, Senate Bill 2, where the fight was who the transgenders wanted to use the bathroom of their choice. And we got into this debate and it had a law passed, and Charlotte was the hub of the fight. And it became so bitter that we lost as Atlanta has lost the baseball game, we lost the NBA All-Star game because of that bill. We also lost hundreds of millions of dollars worth of groups coming here for their conventions. I think we even lost the Democrat convention. So we have felt from the state level how difficult it can be. And I think our state, generally people get along and they try to do what a compromise looks like. It's very difficult even at the state level. If you do compromises, they think you're selling out. They just think you're selling out. And you have a chance because, as you mentioned, as Karl mentioned, the redistricting, people, if they sell out, they compromise, they could very well lose in the next election. It's just a serious thing. Compromise is a bad word at the local and at the federal level.
Right. And I've heard that as well. I'm sure you've heard that too, Mr. Dean, about compromise being a dirty word. It's in some circles, it's sort of it dilutes the purity, the advocacy, the strength of the opinion.
Right. I think you definitely see that in Tennessee. And I think you see it because it's the dominant party, the Republican Party, where the elections are decided in the primary, that a candidate can be primaried who is more moderate, centrist, and be challenged from the right and lose. And the person who beaten them might not be as strong a candidate overall, but they can win a primary. And that happens in the Democratic Party, I'm sure, in other states, New York or other places, where you have the same pressure that kind of moves people to the extreme because of one party domination. And I would blame that, not entirely on gerrymandering, because I think Tennessee just actually is a more conservative Republican dominated state, but gerrymandering certainly around the country and in Tennessee probably has made that worse.
I agree with Karl completely. In North Carolina, probably, if you look at the Senate, there's probably 8 to 10 seats that are, you could win, either party could win. In the House, maybe 20 seats out of 120. And so if you win in the primary, it's over. And so you have to move as far to the right as you can to get the primary voters. And you never have a chance to debate the issues with a Democrat voter. I never ran in the primary. I always ran against a Democrat opponent. And as a result, we were forced to talk about issues that were important to our district. And I think redistricting has done a terrible thing to our country. We need to get back to letting people vote based on not whether they're Democrat or Republican, but what the issues are that everybody is dealing with.
Right, it's such an important point, and I could share lots of stats, but I won't. But to your point about redistricting and a big cause of the division in the country, but because it's redistricting, I mean, we're as an individual watching this program today might think, I'm just one person, I can't change redistricting. Many of the causes of polarization, they're very systemic, they're very big, like partisan gerrymandering or closed primary party primaries, or even social media, search engine algorithms, or the $1 billion political donors, shrinking public square. These are huge problems. But what can we do as individuals? Do you see some of these systemic, really big problems as things that we as individuals can chip away at? And if so, what's your advice? Like, how do we do that? How can we prevent partisan gerrymandering from continuing? And what can we as individuals do against some of these massive systemic problems? And if I can, Mr. Daughtry, I'll start with you this time.
I was hoping you'd start with Karl because that is a good question. I think I look at short-term and long-term solutions.
Okay.
In the long term, we've got to exhaust every remedy to make sure that our legislators and those that are involved are willing to an independent bill that has to do with redistricting, to where we have an independent commission. It's vital and it's important. I think there is a lot of support for it, but the party in power really hates to give that up. It's almost like taking a lot away. So it's something we need to get the parties so closer together that they realize that redistricting would be helpful to the country, not to an individual party. We haven't even come close to getting there. Long term, another idea is that former Senator Joe Lieberman and Larry Hogan, the governor of Maryland, have formed what they call a no label group that tries to get the members of Congress, both the Senate and the House, to meet as a caucus to try to get things done, to try to get to the middle and reach compromise. They're doing the best they can locally and presently to make a difference. As far as SIBF, we are a business-oriented group, and I suppose businesses at some point in time have got to reflect what the issues are besides making a profit. You've got to talk about health care, you've got to talk about a living wage, women's rights. I mean, a number of things that businesses are going to have to take on and show to the world that we are serious about these issues that we are facing and are willing to help in that respect. But that's going to take a lot of time.
I like how you framed it, short-term and long-term. And I wonder for you, Mr. Dean, do you see a similar path forward for us to tackle these massive systemic problems like partisan gerrymandering?
Right. Well, I agree with Leo on the partisan gerrymandering. And I think that, they're probably Arnold Schwarzenegger's greatest contribution to American politics was gerrymandering and sort of dealing with that issue in California, setting a model and trying to do it by a commission. And Arnold, who at that point was a highly regarded Republican, came in and won an election after somebody was kicked out of office. And that's an issue that both parties could latch onto. And I'm a little quite a few more northern states have done it, probably more Democratic states have done it. But I think that's something that if people, both parties, start talking about, saying they're willing to do this, perhaps there's a chance of getting it done. And Leo's exactly right. I'm not optimistic either party. The Democrats are in charge, Republicans are in charge. It's pretty hard to say I'm going to walk away from making it guaranteed that we're going to win all seats. But that's what's got to happen, and that's leadership. I think that an emphasis more in schools, and this is an opportunity where the federal government may be able to do something in terms of funding on civics and history. Just because the more you understand history, I think the more optimistic you are about our country in many ways, and you certainly understand and treasure the values of democracy and equal representation that the country has been founded on. That is important, and I would love to see that get done. I think looking out for people's right to vote is critical. I mean, that has never been like something that we have been controversial, but people should be able to vote, and the more that vote, the better. That's a good thing. And then I think going back to this idea of how local government's different, on a local level, what other party you're in, you're going to work with business because you get it that you want your town to succeed, you want your city to succeed, and it's only going to succeed as if there are jobs there and there's a future there, and if you're creating enough revenue so you can invest in schools, invest in public safety, and people get it. And I think that if you look at things where you're actually delivering services to people and actually trying to create an area where you want to live and have an area be successful, instead of some of these issues that the federal government deals with, it's easier to get along about it because we all can agree. And obviously there's disagreements that you can have on the political spectrum, but it just seems to me that local issues, in my mind, that in many ways matter more, is kind of easier to work together on because it has immediately impact on everybody in your family, and it's not something that's theoretical up here. That these issues around transgender bills, I mean, that's like looking for a fight, getting into stuff. It's just trying to create a problem. You want things that work. You want the world to function.
And another thing that you would think that the Congress could do, this bill that has to do with not restructuring, what is it? The bill that they're basically trying to decide on how to do today. I can't think of the word.
The infrastructure stuff?
Infrastructure.
Okay.
I'm getting older. The infrastructure bill, you would think that the Democrats and the Republicans could get together. I mean, everybody sees how important this is, not only to our domestic way of life, but to our foreign way of life, to those who are in other countries. And it would seem to me that they could come up with some compromise that would make sense, and how important the infrastructure would be. They all have tried to pass bills, and I think it's a real failure on their part if they can't do that.
Right. And another thought about Congress, which I think there is so much energy in the political system geared toward sort of the social issues, the divisive things, and particularly around the Supreme Court, that it's almost like they run the Senate about who's going to be able to pick the Supreme Court, because those are the issues that get the voters all excited and get the money coming in. And they don't concentrate on things like infrastructure, which could be an enormous boon to our country. And both parties have talked about it. I mean, Trump was talking about infrastructure when he was president. Biden clearly has. Everybody gets it that we have neglected doing that, and this is an opportunity. But I don't know that what has to happen is that they have to be able to agree that if we accomplish something, both parties win, that they both look good. There's kind of too much of we're already fighting the next presidential election, or we're fighting 2022 already, and people don't want the other side to look good.
Absolutely. Well, in the last 5-10 minutes, to both your points, you saw that our country does not have to be this divided. You have both outlined some very specific solutions: nonpartisan redistricting, the Problem Solvers Caucus, the No Labels group in Congress. Talked about the role of business. Business has largely been sitting on the sidelines. saying they could have a more active role, just like SIBF is having. Talked about civics education, and I'm acknowledging SIBF former Chairman Chase Cole, who talked a lot about civics education. We'd like to see a renaissance of that. It talked about voting. You talked about focusing on issues, like common issues like infrastructure, where there is no dirty word of compromise there. Both sides agree that this is useful. These are very important specific strategies for tackling the big picture problems. And I appreciate that you both have answered that very directly. I want to ask a question on the other side of that, which is the more interpersonal type of division. So if we do start to talk about these issues and the person that we're talking to gets very upset or offended, or they shut down the conversation, or it turns into name calling, or suddenly a well-intentioned conversation just goes sideways and ends up in a place where you didn't intend it, you don't want it, but there it is. How do you have those kinds of conversations? How do you bridge those divides with people who don't think like you? And if I can, Mr. Dean, I'll start with you. How do you do it?
Well, for me, I think you start with the premise that you're not going to convert people. I mean, you're not going to have a conversation where someone, sort of like being a lawyer, you're not going to have a witness you're cross-examining and the witness is going to say, like in Perry Mason, oh, you're right, I did it and I was wrong and your client's innocent, and that doesn't happen. I think you have a conversation where you're respectful, where you listen, where you don't judge. And that gets hard because I think people, a lot of issues that people care about and that are divisive are important issues. I mean, you get into discussions about rights of all different groups. Those rights are very important to people. And if they feel they're threatened or being marginalized or or minimalized in a sense, then people get emotional. But I think you got to try to talk those things through in a polite way. I have had arguments and no one wins. I mean, then it becomes just a lot of noise. It's like watching, TV. And I think we should also make an effort. I think one of the things TV does a lot of now, and there's a great book called Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein. He talks about this, that one of the things that I think they do on TV more and more, because the channels are sort of dedicated to one side, is that their goal is to outrage people. And so if they're talking about the other party, they'll pick the most off the wall, unattractive person in that party to represent that party, and both sides do it. And their goal is just to get everybody worked up. And I think you got to avoid that. You got to avoid just trying to get people worked up. You want to be able to talk in a rational way. And I believe the vast majority of people in this country are still rational, and people can still talk to each other. You can disagree. You can be friends even. And so that's my thoughts.
Those are great thoughts. Thank you for it. How about for you, Mr. Daughtry? How do you reduce that interpersonal conflict when those conversations start to go awry?
Well, when you being in a majority leader, at times you have to talk to your caucus, and you'll find members of your caucus, as you do in life, many of them are single issue people. All they care about is abortion. All they care about are gun rights. They're those. You have to talk around those. You can't talk to them about those two particular issues. You got to find some other issues that they care about somewhat and try to bring them into the fold. Common ground for a lot of politicians is trying to get enough people to vote in such a way that they can get something done. And common ground is hard to find. It's always been hard to find, but I think probably now it's more difficult than ever. But when you talk to people and they get mad with you, you just have to back off somewhat and try another angle. There's going to be people out there, and they've always been there, who have these wild ideas that you probably can't talk to. But that's all right. But there are plenty of people that you can sit down and exhaust all of the avenues that you can find to bring them into a place where they're ready to talk about compromise or common ground that maybe we should get something done some way or the other. And I think that can be done, but it takes, you can't do it to everybody you talk to. It's just impossible.
Fair enough. And that has been my experience as well. There's some times where you try and try and try, and it just doesn't work. And in those cases, we've got to agree, okay, fine. That person we can't reach. We can't build a bridge to everywhere. There's some people who take it even one step further. We talked about compromise being the dirty word. Some people think of this broader notion of civil discourse as a useless exercise. They're very cynical about it, and they'll argue that civil discourse diminishes their justified and righteous anger over issues, really important issues like you're talking about, Mr. Dean, but it masks that, it hides it with false politeness and requires them to abandon their authentic emotions and values for platitudes. Do you think that this civil discourse, this effort to communicate with people who are not like us, do you think it is overrated, or do you think it is essential, or somewhere in between? Mr. Daughtry, I'd like to kind of get your thoughts about how important do you think these kinds of conversations are?
I think they are essential, that we have a conversation, a way to talk to each other, that we can get along. I mean, democracy is founded upon the fact that we can have conversations together and come somewhere in the middle and solve our problems. And without that, we are just going to get worse and worse till we're finally in two tribes and hate each other and afraid of each other. I think talking to each other is very important.
Yeah, to me, I think the key thing is, number one, you can't persuade somebody by yelling at people. You can't, I mean, when the volume's too high, there's no listening going on. And so I think the key thing to any civic discourse or conversation is really the listening aspect. I mean, the talking part is important, but you got to listen to each other. And if you listen to each other and actually hear, then you're going to learn something, and maybe you get closer together. There's a time and a place if you feel that your rights or you have strong opinions that need to be voiced more, the higher volume, but it's probably better not in a conversation. You got to, and again, you got to put emphasis on listening. Listening is kind of the key. I mean, I think part of the problem is we're so busy, there's so little time. People look to pick their positions by what my party is going to do. Somebody else kind of decides it for them. People aren't listening and learning, and you got to lower the volume to do that.
Absolutely. I'm a board member of an organization called the Listen First Project, and there's maybe 300 different organizations in that umbrella group, and it all focuses on the listening first. And listening is something that in theory we can all do. But my question for both of you really is about the role of SIBF, right? So this is a business community, very sophisticated folks who are part of this group, all with the intent of making our country better, making our world better, and bringing their best selves and their best resources to the table. And I wonder what advice you would have for SIBF members specifically, knowing where everybody is, knowing you can imagine the faces and the names in this group. What advice do you have for us in SIBF? How can we improve ourselves in our world in terms of the deep divisions that separate us? What can SIBF members do? And if I can, Mr. Daughtry, I'd like to start with you for this SIBF specific question.
Well, in a business, and I've been in business a long time, your main job is to make a profit. That's what you're in business for, is to make a profit and make a healthy way of life. But I think going forward, there may be more to it than just making a profit. You may have to talk about, well, a living wage. Are our employees making a living wage? Can they survive on what we're paying them? Or can we pay them more and not bother our bottom line? Number two, the healthcare. Healthcare is so important to everybody, to make sure that their family, he doesn't worry or she doesn't worry about her family or his family when they go home at night, because they have health care. I think security in their job is important. there's a number of things that businesses can do to demonstrate that they are aware of their employees and they're willing to make those changes or certainly add to what they are doing to set an example for others who see them as the leaders of their community.
Well, I think Leo's points are great. I think business is unique in the sense that it is one entity, one institution that really can bring people together from each party. I mean, I look at it this way. If you look at some of the things that have happened in a city, for instance, business is generally ahead of the political community when it came to issues like having a diverse workforce. I think business in many cases is ahead in sort of recognizing the importance than politics does in many cases of having policies that help workers in terms of whether it's education or whether it's health. I think it's important for, and the business has done this, I think, on gay rights, certainly civil rights, speak up on these issues. And I think it's important for everyone to hear that. I think it's important for Democrats to listen to business talk about budgets and balancing budgets and creating jobs. I mean, if you don't create jobs, if you don't have economic opportunity, nothing good's going to happen. I mean, you can want all these social programs and all these advancements to help people live better lives, but you can't get them unless you're creating jobs, unless you're creating wealth and opportunity. And so I think SIBF and business has a huge role to play going forward. And they've been playing a role. They've been playing sort of a moderating role, I think, in the last 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that. So in the course of our conversation so far, we've talked about how we as individuals can dent these big systemic problems. And we talked about our role as business leaders in our community and what specifically we can do in that arena as well. And then we talked about the interpersonal, what we can do even with our own loved ones and folks across the fence or across the dinner table from us and how we can get along. So the theme of the talk today was about politics. How can we get along? And I think we got to a lot of fertile ground there. Let me ask you folks one more question before we go to the Q&A, which will be led by Chase Cole. And my last question for you is just a softball, gentlemen. I just want to ask, are there any final thoughts that you want all of us to know in thinking about politics? How can we get along? So really just a big, broad question. And if I can, I'll start with you, Mr. Dean. Is there anything else that you want us to think about, to know about? And then I'll go to you, Leo, and then we'll go to our Q&A.
Yeah, I think overall, and I think this probably has come across from both of our comments, is I don't want people to be discouraged. I do think we're at a point, and as I said, I do think the Trump years were somewhat of an anomaly in American history, and hopefully we move forward from there, that we have had our history of disagreements. And we are in a period of time where elections are unusually close at the national level. There was a period like this during Reconstruction in the last part of the 19th century where we had elections that were just, neck and neck, and we're going through that again. And that increases tensions. But we have made a lot of progress as a country. And I am very confident in our future. I don't want to sound too Pollyannish, but I do think we're going to get through this. I do think that we're going to be closer in the future, but we have difficult issues. And part of it is we are such a dynamic country. Part of it comes because there is so much diversity, which is a good thing. I mean, pluralism made this country great, but that creates tensions, and we're just going through a rough patch, and things will be all right.
Thank you for that. How about for you, Mr. Daughtry? Any parting thoughts for us, things that we ought to know that we haven't touched on yet?
Well, I think the key, and I think Karl has mentioned this, is leadership. We have had a dearth of leadership at the federal level and somewhat at the state level to pull us together. I mean, if you look back in history, someone has stepped up and said, look, let's all pull together. And whether it was Reagan or Roosevelt or whoever it was, someone showed up that got us on the road of unity and compromise and good feelings about each other. We really don't have good feelings about those that we are opposed to or who are different than us. And breaking down the issues and, you know, I think the real conservatives think that their traditional values are being eroded. And I think they worry about that. And the progressives say that we can't just stay with the status quo. We've got to do something to improve our lot. And both sides are afraid of each other. And pulling those two together is going to take some really strong leadership. But we've always had someone to step up, and I'm confident that this great country will find someone again who can do that for the common good, because that's what we have in a democracy, is the common good. And we need to remember that. We sometimes forget that the common good is for everyone, for the majority of people. And I'm hopeful and believing that we will, down the road, find that person or those people who can do that.
Absolutely. Well said. We'll get through the rough patch for the common good. I'll leave it there and defer to Chase so we can talk us through some of the questions that have been coming into the Q&A panel and portion. So Chase, if you can, what kind of questions have you been hearing? Let's see, it appears that maybe there's a technical issue. I'm not sure, but just in case there is one, I will go ahead and.
No, I'm here.
Oh, sorry.
Kamy.
Okay.
It's that age-old technical issue of somebody not remembering to unmute themselves. So sorry about that.
All right.
And thank you for leading such a interesting, timely, and important discussion. And Leo and Karl, thank you so much for your constructive, positive suggestions on so many aspects of this very difficult problem. Let's start with a fun suggestion. It comes from somebody who always teaches me something, Shannon Williams, who had number one because he got to type his in before everybody else joined the show here. He's taught me that there's something called contact hypothesis. And I think that means that social interaction can be a helpful bridge between people. And I think that gets back to the point that both Karl and Leo were making about listening and helpful, positive conversations. But more specifically, would social interaction between elected officials help? I'm thinking of happy hours at the White House, even if we don't have a rose garden anymore. What do you think?
I think that's a great idea. I think social interaction is important. Anytime you can get groups together, there is possibilities that they'll like one another. There's possibilities they won't. But what they do that is a little bit harmful is the facts. What are the facts? And each side has what they believe are the facts, and they're the same facts, but when they present them in such a way that it divides people. And social interaction with the facts, whatever they are, might be a good way for us to figure out what really needs to be done based on what we know needs to be done, rather than what somebody tells us needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly can't hurt. This has been thought to have been a problem in DC for quite a while now, since fundraising and the demands on our elected representatives are so great time-wise that they don't have the time they used to have to sit and talk to each other. And I'm sure something has been lost in that. Certainly trust is probably lost in that. Certainly the ability to hear other opinions and to take it in a meaningful process is lost. So, we'll see. I mean, Obama, of course, remember, he was always told or criticized saying you ought to have Mitch McConnell over for drinks. more. And then I guess he finally said to somebody, well, why don't you have them over to your house for drinks? I don't know whether it will make a huge difference, but it can't hurt, that's for sure.
I think Tip O'Neill and
Yeah.
President Reagan had beer together almost every afternoon. I guess
Yeah,
they
that tradition goes back a long ways. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, maybe we can approach that next time we're in DC together for our Washington briefing and talk to some of our elected officials about that. Next questions, I'm going to direct to Leo. It's about climate change. And Leo, taking off on your excellent point earlier about how, my words, not yours, we all use roads and bridges, and infrastructure ought to be something we can find common ground on. Don't you, particularly given the strong consensus in a lot of public opinion polls on environmental issues, don't you feel that addressing climate change is something we ought to be able to agree on? And isn't this a good opportunity for the Republicans to show some leadership towards unifying us?
Are you asking, should the climate change be part of the infrastructure bill?
Not specifically, but as a separate issue, is that not an opportunity for Republicans to bridge a gap and show some leadership towards unity?
I think so. I think people are beginning to realize how very serious climate change is and how it's happening so rapidly. But with the infrastructure bill, if we could just get that passed, and if those who are in charge would look and see what we can do and what we cannot do, it would seem to me that that would be a real step in a good direction. And with climate change, if you could find out what are the things that both parties can agree on, at least start at that point. You can't have the whole meal until you've gotten the meal cooked.
Great, thank you. We had several questions on gerrymandering and nonpartisan redistricting, which I think you all have addressed through the main portion of the program. So let's move to one on cancel culture. How much is it to blame for the lack of ability to compromise, and how do we reverse that? Either one of you want to take it. Karl, you want to start?
I guess I'm a little confused as to how you would define cancel culture. If it's defined as sort of not listening to or banning people from speech or from presenting their views, I mean, certainly that is part of it. I mean, I do think there has been a tendency to say we're going to disinvite people whose views are different from us to speak at universities, to speak to groups. And I don't like that because I believe number one, I believe in the First Amendment. And number two, I believe you don't learn anything unless you listen to people and people who may have different views. I don't know if that answers the question, because the whole concept of cancel culture as to what it actually means is a little vague to me.
Exactly. Leo, any thoughts?
I agree. I don't like when someone is fired summarily from their job because of what they said, unless it was so egregious, and what I've seen on TV didn't appear to be that egregious. I think the pendulum has swung so far that way that we're seeing things happen that doesn't make any sense to me with cancel culture. I hope that we'll let the First Amendment let people say what they want to say, and if the public doesn't like them, then they'll get rid of them that way.
Yeah.
And Chase, if I can, I just want to add one thing to the cancel culture comment here. I work at a university, and every time we invite a speaker, left or right, somebody's going to be upset, right? So the idea that people are upset because of the speakers is not a new thing. The new thing is, of course, shouting them down where they don't even get an opportunity to speak, or disinviting them, getting the professors in trouble, getting the institutes and departments in trouble for having invited certain speakers. So that, of course, nobody wants that, right? We don't want a purity test, particularly not on university campuses, where the whole idea is we're exposing people to challenging viewpoints so they can strengthen and develop their own views. It is antithetical to what a university exists to do. But that said, I do think sometimes people try hard to be antagonistic, and to the points that Leo and Karl made, language matters. And if we can try to build a bridge, try to show that our intentions are good by using language, by trying to communicate with people, by listening, instead of being antagonistic, I think it will go, it will be a helpful step in reducing the drive towards that cancel culture, which we all oppose.
Exactly. Thank you. Taking off from the earlier discussion on the importance of civic education and our studying our own history in schools, I think we all agreed on that. How do we do that given the polarization, the political polarization that often exists in our boards of education?
That's a very good question. I know in North Carolina, the debate rages about what history we should teach and how much American history we teach and how much we should add to it so that minority people are not left out in history. And if we can get to the point where we can agree civics is the most important class right now in school, if we can get it to understand in history, understand what our country has done and who we are and where we've come from. It's just like you say, the devil is in the details.
Karl, did you deal with this as mayor? Any unique perspectives from that experience?
No, I don't, I never had, during my time, a big issue in the schools that regarding what they were teaching in their curriculum. I do have the sense that history and particularly civics does not get the attention I would like to see it have. I mean, when you talk to people, and particularly young people, and their lack of understanding of how government actually operates, to me, is pretty key. And I think the events that occurred on January 6th, to me, sort of show the need for a civics lesson about how we elect our president, how the process works, how democracies function. It's going to, if something is proposed about doing more history or more civics, if the proposer is seen as an advocate for one party or the other, that may raise concerns. But this seems to me to be an issue that there should be pretty broad agreement about. Politicians, school board shouldn't be dictating what the curriculum is in history. I mean, they should have an opportunity to, it should be taught straightforward, and politics shouldn't be part of it. And it just should be history that encompasses our whole country. And it's going to be controversial. I mean, history is filled with events that people are going to disagree about or not want to talk about, but that's what we got to do.
Can I add one thing to that too, which is civics education currently receives about 5 cents for every dollar spent at the state level. So it's a 1 semester course, typically in a student's senior year. That's civics. Whereas STEM education, so the science, technology, engineering, math, that's about 50 cents of the dollars that go into education by subject area. So STEM is getting a disproportionate amount of dollars. Civics is not as well funded as it ought to be. There is the Coons, Cornyn bill right now, which is slated to put $1 billion into civics education. And the folks I'm talking to in DC say it could pass. It needs a little help. So for those of you who believe strongly in civics education, as George Washington did with his university, as did Thomas Jefferson with his university, as did Ben Franklin with his university, our founding fathers thought universities were super important. Civics education was perhaps the most important part of our educational system. If you believe in that, get behind the Coons-Cornyn bill.
That's a great point, Kamy. And it's probably true that business groups, this may be an opportunity for business groups to speak because the STEM emphasis is largely, I think, because of the interest in preparing students for the workforce. And if business were to speak to the importance of this, maybe we could find some improvement there. Here's a question on whether we've got too much focus at the national level, where it's harder to agree. I think the point was made earlier that we do a better job at the local level of getting things done and agreeing. Is there a way, without amending the Constitution, and this is my words, not those of the questioner, to let more issues be decided at the state level? And if there's not, and if you don't agree with that approach, is that not likely to be the result of continued gridlock at the federal level?
Well, I served at the state level, and obviously, the more you can do at that level, the more you understand better the people's needs than you do in Washington. But Washington has such a broad spectrum that they can work from, and they have all the money. We have a Interstate 95 that desperately needs resurfacing, but it costs $1 billion a mile. We can't pay that. We don't have the money. We can, our share is going to be 10%, but the federal government has to get involved in many things that we are unable to do because of money and because of our border lines. So I think there's a role for both to play, and I hope that the federal government will allow the states to do more, but they have to fund what they ask us to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, clearly there are things that the federal government does that puts the focus on the federal government more so than other governments, because the federal government is everybody. It's the entire country. It's, you know, it's foreign relations, it's healthcare, it's our interstate system. It's a major leader in our economy. It's you know, it is the driving force. And so there's a natural tendency to focus more news-wise on the national entity than local or state governments. I think that's correct. I do think it's important that the governments work to cooperate at the different levels. I mean, I would say one of my frustrations as mayor was, I think, during sort of some of this more partisan time period, we had more interference from the state in the operation of local government than there was in the past. And I think that's a reoccurring problem around the country, that state governments have begun to interfere with local governments more than they used to, and often on issues that are not, they really don't need to, in my humble opinion.
Thank you. We're getting lots of questions in the chat, so I'm gonna try to speed us up and get to as many of them as we can. Real quickly, from our chairman, David Zacks, there's a initiative by the Lieutenant Governor of Georgia to start a new anti-Trump conservative party. Will we see new parties formed, and will they have a chance of success?
I don't think so. I think what's happening is the independents are growing at a rapid rate, more so than Democrats and Republicans. But I doubt that a third party could be viable at this time. I'm hopeful that the Republican Party will reshape itself after the loss during the last election to more recognize who they have been, and they have been for so many years. I don't think that starting a new party would work throughout the country.
Yeah, I would be I think it'd be a very difficult thing to do, and I'd be surprised if anybody was able to successfully do that. I mean, I think the feeling is always there that there is some middle area that is sort of a fiscal, responsible, respecter of individual rights party that would have broad appeal, but I don't see that happen. I think it's going to be fascinating to watch, just as a interest in politics and history, to watch what the Republican Party does over the next few years, and sort of just determining what it is, and that'll play itself out. But third parties don't generally work.
Yeah, and if I can, real quick, Chase, on that point, the last survey I saw about this sort of the intra-party divisions within the Republican Party was in March. and it was by Fabrizio Lee and Associates. They showed that 15% of Republican voters are strongly anti-Trump. So that's a solid 15%. 20% of the party support Trump, but they want someone else to lead the GOP. The other 65% of the Republican Party still support the former president and believe he should continue to lead the GOP. So an anti-Trump focused party doesn't seem like it's going to get enough Republican support. I'd say that for that intent, they probably ought to go back to focusing on nonpartisan redistricting and perhaps open primaries and other ways to sort of make the incentive different in the primary phases. So we don't have polarized candidates who advance. We have more moderate candidates advancing.
Well, and then this has only been, this is April. The elections were held in November. While Trump is influential at this point, 2 years from now, who knows? This whole world can change, particularly in politics. And I think new leaders will step up. I think new people out there will see the need to challenge the status quo and perhaps lead us to a different place than we are now.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to go to lightning round now to get as many of these remaining questions in as we can. Short answers, please. Why is requiring voter ID and secure elections so hard to agree upon? Can't this be done without voter suppression?
I'll start. I'll take a shot at that. I think everybody now requires some type of ID. Whatever you do, whatever job you have, where you go to the grocery store, whatever you do, you almost have to have an ID if you want to cash a check, you want to fly on an airplane. I don't think it's asking too much to have an ID for people who want to vote. I think other states have had it for years. It's not a problem. I think people believe that there's some ulterior motive to suppress voters by having an ID. I don't think that's the case in North Carolina.
Well, I will say this. I think part of the issue around voting rights is that there is so little fraud. And so many of these things that have come up that get people nervous because there is not really a major problem. And my big concern would be if we do things that limit the time people have to vote, limit their access to the polling place. Some form of ID, I think people agree, is you need secure elections, but I think we have them. And now the issue is how do we expand the franchise to get more people voting? And that's a good thing for our country. More people will vote.
One questioner very intrigued by the discussion of the voice of business in addressing these issues. And its leaders, she believes, have to ask, do we prepare for our future with a recognition of our differences or continue fighting age-old issues? Any thoughts?
Well, we're going to continue to fight. I mean, the classic issue, how much government involvement should there be in the economy? How much should the government spend? I mean, people have different philosophical beliefs upon that, those who believe that the government should spend very little and interfere in the economy very little have their reasons for thinking that, and there's plenty of scholarship and reason behind it. And the other view has the same thing, and that issue is not going to, people are going to debate that from here on out. And so I think we just have to recognize politics is about big issues where there are different opinions, and people are going to have to work those things through, and we should do it in a civil way that involves listening to each other and trying to find compromise and solutions that allow us to move forward. But we're going to have disagreements, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, disagreeing is not bad. It's how you do it.
I think Karl's exactly right. He's a Democrat, I'm a Republican. We have always had differences, tax issues regarding estate tax or rates for corporations and individuals. The issues of immigration. There are many issues that we'll have as time goes by, and how we solve them is not what we think, but what we can get done by compromise.
Excellent, thank you. I think some of you will know the source of this question. I'll leave it to you to deduce that based on its topic, demographics. To reduce polarization, don't we have to address the fears in certain portions of our population of being displaced by the country's changing demographics and or the changing nature of the economy.
Well, I mean, I think the question basically is the sense that the United States is going to become increasingly diverse, and the position of white America is going to become different than what it has been. And clearly, that is a change that causes social tensions, that's going to cause insecurity, and needs to be thought about and addressed as it can be. But at the same time, we have done this before. I mean, we have gone through periods of big immigration. We have gone through periods where our country has changed dramatically in terms of its demographic makeup, and we have gotten through it. And I would argue, and I really believe this, that again, the great thing about the United States is pluralism, whether it's demographics, whether it's religion, whether it's ideas. That's what makes us special. That's what makes us a great place. And that will become a strength for us. But I think the question identifies a real issue and a real political problem or situation.
I think you're right. Demographics is going to be something we're going to have to deal with. We have immigration laws that we have on our books. I've had clients and friends who have tried to become citizens of our country, and sometimes it would take years and years. And finally, they would get the okay that they were going to get sworn in after they took their tests and everything. And we have had many good people come from other countries who have been just a rock star for our country. I don't know that it seems to me we ought to have some control over those who come into our country. I don't know how we do that, but I don't think we should open our borders and say, welcome, you are here and we'll make the best of it. I think we need to have some laws that we can use to control those people who come into our country.
I think if I could just chase this one thing, I would say on immigration and sort of recognizing the value of diversity, that this is where business has a great role and has played a great role. I mean, business position on immigration is pretty is close to or the same as mine, or whether that's useful or not. But I think business has understands that our future lies along having the talent here, the people who are engaged and want to work, entrepreneurs, and their position in general on issues around immigration is somewhere where SIBF, I think, could be a real strong voice. I think people just get it. They get it that this is not ruining our country. It's actually having people come here makes our country stronger. And I certainly agree we ought to have laws and we ought to enforce our laws, but immigration's been a big plus for us and will be in the future too.
Excellent. Very, very fascinating answers. I think we're going to have to stop it there given the time, and my apologies to those of my friends who I see with great questions lined up. Maybe we can preserve those and send out some email thoughts or something to address them. I'm just sorry I couldn't get through all of them for you. But Kamy, I've got to take one last privilege and ask my favorite question, which I don't even think requires an answer, from an anonymous attendee. A question for Leo, his former colleague in the North Carolina legislature. Leo, when did you get so wise?
Well, it just happened overnight.
All right. Well, with that, I think we'll turn it over to Nancy to wrap us up. And thanks again to the panelists for stimulating, wonderful discussion.
Thank you all.